In this video we're going to have a look at how to tie tails and what they do for the fly. Tails are usually the first elements that we tie onto the fly. They can represent the tails of the fly in most instances, but in some instances they can be in there to represent the shock as it's hatched into the adult. The first things we'll do would be to tie some simple tails using hackle fibres. Take a bunch of hackle fibres from a fairly large hackle. When you're tying silk down towards the bend of the hook, this is the classic technique of tying your tails in. Simply put your tails on top of the hook, measure them to the length that you want them to be, grip them firmly with your left hand, pinch and loop, 3 pinch and loop, tied in place, and there you have your tails neatly tied in. You can then run your tying silk up the shank of the hook, form a nice smooth body, bring it back down again, to the point of the end of the body, and then you're ready to tie in whatever element goes next, either be the body or the rib, and as you proceed to tie the rest of your fly. Like everything else that we do with fly tying, there's usually more than one way that we can tie anything in or proceed with any technique. Another way to do this procedure is simply to bring your thread down about halfway down the body. Take your bunch of hackle fibres, again measure them in place. We want the right length, we want the length of the body, the tails about the same length as the body. So we tie them into place there, we pinch and loop, make sure that we've got the right length, and then simply proceed down the shank of the hook, turn by turn, keeping a grip with the tails until we get to a point where we want to stop. And there are our tails tied in, sitting nicely on the top of the shank of the hook, and we can tie in the rest of the fly. So those are 2 slight variations on how to tie hackle fibres. We can use hackle fibres from a simple genetic cock or a genetic hen. We can use hackle fibres from mallard breast feathers and feathers of that type, Conque de Lion. Anything of that type will give you whatever is required for your particular fly. When tying tails in for a mayfly, the tails are usually a lot longer than the body. Twice as long and sometimes 3 times as long as the body itself. And for these we tend to use longer fibres. We tend to use pheasant tail fibres. We may use buck tail fibres, or we could use moose hair. In this instance we've got some moose hair, and we'll simply tie 2 hairs in, but we need the fibres at least twice as long as the body. So we tie our 2 fibres into place, simply tie them on the top of the shank of the hook, hold them in place, and run your tying silk down, keeping the fibres on top of the hook shank all of the way down until we get almost to the point sort of thing. Then simply put your thumbnail on the top of the hook, and you'll split the fibres like so. There will simply become the outrigger's single element of your fly. So one goes off to the right, one goes off to the left. You can then pull them apart, kink them slightly, and there we have our two individual fibres. You can then proceed and tie your body in whichever way you prefer to do. One way to emphasize the split would be simply to take some tying thread. I've got a different coloured tying thread this time, just so it sticks out a little bit more. Take a loop underneath the shank of the hook, bring it round on the loop of the hook onto the bend itself, bring that loop up over the top, like so, and tie that off. And what you have done now is you've separated the two fibres with your tying thread, and they will never come together. They'll stay apart all the time. For completeness, it would be best if you tied it with the same colour tying thread, but in this instance we've used some olive just so that you can see it that much more clearly. You won't be able to see the olive colouring on the fly itself because there's literally only one turn of it. But there we have our two fibres sitting apart, and they've been separated by our tying silk. That's one way of tying them in and keeping them separate. On some of the flies that you tie, the requirement would be for 3 tails, and the same thing applies with that. We simply prepare our body in the same manner. This time we'll take 3 of our fibres, like so. We tie all 3 in on the top, try and get the tails to be much the same sort of length. Again, at least twice as long. With the adult mayfly, they can be as long as 3 times as long. And if you progress even further and you get down to tying canis, they're 5 or 6 times longer than the actual body itself. So we take our 3 turns, 3 fibres on the top, take them down. Once again, we can press just to separate them. Bend that one to that side, this one to this side, and we've got our 3. If we need this to maintain the separation, same as we did before, take our tying thread, a loop of tying thread around the bend of the hook, like so, tie it in, bring the loop into place, bring one side of the centre piece, one the other side, simply hold them in place, bring your tying thread over the top, latch it into place, and there you have your 3 tails neatly separated by just 1 turn of tying silk. You haven't added any bulk to the fly at all, and now you have 3 different tails nicely splayed out as per the actual insect. And that's the way to tie your tails in for the standard mayfly tying. As we said at the start, the tails, when we tie them in, don't necessarily imitate the actual tails of a fly, but may in fact imitate the shuck from which the fly is hatching. And the method for doing that is to use some golden pheasant tippets, and the way to use them is simply to take your tippet feather, peel back, the fibres like so, cut off the centre, like so. Bring the fibres back again, peel back so that we end up with something that looks a little bit like that. And having achieved that, simply moisten them and fold them over together. Place them on the shank of the hook. Take the scrap out of there. We've got them the right length now. You tie them, take them on the top, pinch them in place. We want the final bar of the black to be just as it leaves the fly itself. Simply take that pinching loop, tie it in place, bring your tying silk down, nice even turns, and there we have our shuck in place. We can then proceed and tie. And this is these will be the tails from flies such as a black pennel or of that ilk, as it's to imitate the shuck as it is left behind by the fly as it takes to the air, having hatched out through the surface. Another feather to be used in some of the more traditional flies would be to use a golden pheasant crest. And here we have one here, and once again we simply take our crescent feather, tie it in slightly on this side, on my side of the hook, and then proceed down. And as you tighten in, then you'll gradually put feather under the top of the hook, and there will give you your, again, more imitating of the shuck than actual tail, but it's quite an effective way of doing that. And having tied them in, simply then proceed to tie in the rib, the body, and whatever else is going on. Possibly the most common materials used, particularly by modern still water fishermen for their tails, would be the marabou. A turkey marabou in all sorts of colours and varieties is very popular as a very mobile tail. The way to handle the marabou is simply to moisten the index and thumb of your right hand, moisten the index of your left hand, smooth the fibres so that they stick together, and simply tie in your fibres. Once again, simple pinch and loop. Run the tying silk down to your point nice and firmly, keeping the fibres to the top of the hook firmly in place. And having that is to then finger and thumb, and pinch and snap off to give you the end of your tail. Don't cut with the scissors. The scissors will give you an abnormal you get a nice ragged finish if you simply pinch and tear with finger and thumb, then you can then proceed and tie the fly as we would have done under normal circumstances. Another fairly mobile tail which you can tie would be with hackle tips. Simply take your hackle, bring the fibres back, you take two of them, Place them face to face, shiny side on the inside. Remove the fibres from the stem to give you the bare stem. Simply place the bare stem on top of the shank of the hook. Simple turn like so. We can cut off the scrap that just gets in the way, and in this way we end up with two hackle fibres, two hackle tips on top of the hook in place, and they will, because they're the natural curvature is to bend them out, then they will separate and give us a nice divided tail. That will give us some mobility. Certainly some versions of the Montana are tied with tails of this type. You find that some of the New Zealand patterns use this type of tail in quite a lot. So it's another type of tail to tie for different circumstances for different flies. As I said, once again, you simply proceed on with the rest of your fly. You can chop this scrap off here. You don't need that anymore. And then we can then tie the rest of our fly as we would have done naturally.